can I just say that it's really good to see all of you here today, but there's a huge amount of familiar faces in this room, right? When I look around this room, it's like this is pretty much my Facebook friends list. So what I'd like you to do for our next event, when we do announce it, which hopefully will be towards the end of next month, is to bring with you one person who's never been to one of these events before, never been to something that talks about a different narrative of history from what we learn in schools or what we hear from our government. So that's your homework. Think of this as the reverse Fight Club. Rule 1 of living with myths is to talk about living with myths. Rule 2 of living with myths is to talk about living with myths. Okay? So all of you, you can see we actually have a lot, we actually have more space than we thought we would. So do bring someone with you next time. Okay, so before I go on, I should introduce some of the other people who have made this possible. I want to thank Prashant back there, the owner of Artistry. Thank you very much for hosting us. Jack here in front is my colleague with on the Living with Myth. And Cynthia, where are you? Who is, yes, back there, who is our webmaster, who has done a fantastic job. Visit our website, livingwithmyths.com, and our Facebook page to learn about our next seminar. And also our other collaborator, Dan, in the corner. Right. Okay, so the first question is why myths, right? What is living with myths? Why myths? Okay, and so this is, I'm reading this note from Ka Seng. So he writes, the catalyst for me was the Channel News Asia documentary on the Hockley bus riots in the Days of Rage series. Those, all of you remember that from, was it January? January, yeah, or December, I think even. The episode ignored the counter-hegemonic viewpoints offered by Otto Fong, Tham Ping Jin, other activists of the 1950s, and myself, I think. It was concerned only to reinforce the myth of communist subversion and the rescuing of Singapore by one man, whose role is captured in the episode's final scene. But the occasion is more important than the catalyst. Days of Rage was merely one in a long list of government-commissioned projects on the history of Singapore as our nation celebrates its 50th year next year. It became imperative in my mind that we should commence a series of talks and a public discourse to investigate the myths of Singapore and to consider what being a nation means to us. But what are myths? What is myths about? 50 comes across as a big number, a good reason to celebrate. But unlike a person's birthday, 50 also tells us that the nation is not a natural state of affairs. It came into existence at a certain time, it is constructed and it is sustained, among other things, by a number of mythic stories about the origin of the nation. So what we mean by myths are these stories that have a broad social influence which shape our identity. These stories have an ability to make values and stock positions that would otherwise be debatable seem natural and commonsensical. Thus, myths are subtle. So the Myths Project is not about myth busting. Myths are not inherently false or bad. For many traditional societies, myths play an integral role in maintaining social identity and harmony. Are myths different in a nation? Yes, because a nation comprises not only the elites but also the people. So the Myths Project strives to look at whether national stories are democratic and inclusive or elitist and exclusive. If myths are judged by cultural criteria, do truth and historical accuracy matter? Yes, and the role of academics and intellectuals in the Myths Project is to show how truth claims in the myths reflect whose stories and whose values. For example, my criticism of the Hockley myth is that it makes untenable truth claims about the bus workers and the unions that underline the threat of communism and the need for strong leadership. Historical research and oral history show, however, that there is another story, subordinate to the official one, the story of collective bargaining, political activism, and the optimism of workers and activists about creating a new nation. This story is arguably more democratic and inclusive than the existing myth. So myths are not fixed, but they change and evolve. 50 years of nationhood is about time for us to rethink the old myths and whether we need new stories. So now I'm going to introduce our chair for this evening, Professor Kwok Kian Woon, who is a sociologist at NTU in the Division of Sociology. And in 2012, he co-edited a book entitled Contestations of Memory in Southeast Asia, which argues that social memory is contested and layered. And so it's very, very much in harmony with our theme of myths this evening.
Scholars, and I noticed that PJ said something about academics and intellectuals. Let me assure you, there are academics who are not intellectuals. There are intellectuals who are not academics, but never mind. One of the things is that history and the work of historical research has really gone beyond the walls of the university. And tonight is yet another occasion to demonstrate that. And yet retaining ideals about scholarly rigor and so on, and sort of contestation of interpretations. Okay, and Lisa also in the last few years have been co-editing at least 2 books, the May 13 Generation, which, and more recently the 1963 Operation Cold Storm. Edgar, together with Kasing and some of the other suspects, was involved in this book called The University Socialist Club and the Contest for Malaya. Right? And I just found out that Edgar is having his last 2 weeks at NUS, and he has allowed me to announce that he'll be going to the University of British Columbia to do his PhD. Yeah, I think that deserves a round of applause.
Talk about some of my views on this what I would consider the myth of student activism in the University of Malaya in Singapore. This is something that I researched in my when I was younger, a few years younger, right? So I won't have the time to present the whole account or chronology of student activism in the University of Malaya and the University of Singapore, which, in case those of you who are younger do not know, were the predecessor institutions of today's NUS, right? Between 1949. When it was established in 1961, it was called the University of Malaya. A brief period, it was called the University of Malaya in Singapore, right? But it split from the University of Malaya to become the University of Singapore in 1962. And then in 1979, University of Singapore and Nanyang University merged to form the present-day NUS. So that's the context, okay? Right, so in a sense, the context of this is that, in recent years, there's increasing interest and attention on the question of history of student activism in Singapore. Right, a lot of the attention has been recently focused on that of the Chinese schools. So if you're interested in a quick read of this recent interest and developments, you can look for Prof. Hong Jian's paper published in 2006, where he talks about the articulation as well as omission of the activism of the students in Singapore from the Singapore story, right? But in recent years, this has been repaired, especially for the Chinese educated students. Like in recent years, there have been a lot of, I'm sure many of you know this, a lot of academic works, commemorative volumes, and even exhibitions. For example, by the one by Tenjin a few years ago on the Chinese schools' activities and activism. Whereas today, I'm here to talk about, in a sense, that of the English educated students of the University of Malaya, right? Which, in a sense, there's a certain degree of amnesia when it comes to their activities and activism, and that's what I'm trying to talk about today, right? Okay, and I'll argue that in the sense that now that we are in this stage where we can talk about being more inclusive both in terms of public memory and our national history, our national narrative, for example, that we should include the stories of all these past activists because making them not, make them become full persons and not nobody, like no actors. But we also want to, in a sense, bring back and consider some of the conflicts, dilemmas, and issues that they encountered during the formative years of our nation building, and revisit them in a new context where, to use what has now become a very cliche of looking at it, right? Where Singapore is in a new, in a sense, a state of confusion and contention over its national identity and future. So maybe it might be timely to bring back this history to, in a sense, we look at what are some of the issues and tensions and what were the resolutions, and we consider these resolutions, if you can call it a resolution, still valid and applicable and relevant today, right, in new context. So today, the myth I will try to engage relates to this activism, or the supposed lack of activism, of the English educated students of the University of Malaya and the University of Singapore. When, of course, as Jin has just now mentioned earlier, when we use the word myth, we don't necessarily mean a story that is fictional or true. right? Usually, in a sense, myths do have some degrees of truth and reality, but in a sense, when I use myth, I'm referring to stories that are told in a particular way, traditional way, that kinds of either simplifies, essentializes, or misrepresents a more complex reality, historical reality. In that sense, the mythic element resides in the way the story is told, right? And hence, it is the way that the story is told that needs to be engaged. I would argue that within Singapore's public memory, the history of activism in the Insular Malay and Singapore, right, suffers from kind of a double marginalization in the sense that there are two kind of mythic elements in it. The first myth relates to how the history, there's this amnesia in the history of student activism, and it's told as if it's a history of general apathy, right, a history of the lack of activism, where the students are presented and perceived as a lot which is stuck in an ivory tower, right, stuck in an ivory tower, stuck in an ivory tower, and they are more known for ragging, stealing panties when they go and attack other hostels, and their interest in studying and scoring well and basically not caring about society, etc. Right, this perception. And there is a lack of remembrance, right, of the activism of the English student activists, right, those who were really active in the Insular Malay and Singapore, except by the past student activists themselves. People like Michael Fernandez have come out to speak up about their experiences and the activism during the war, right? And of course, the institution's own institutional histories, right? In the public domain, however, this lack of memorization gives us an impression, at least for me, right? I mean, this is how I started doing this, in the sense that when I was doing my honors thesis, I was working with Dr. Hong, of course, and I was surprised to discover, right, in the process of doing my honors thesis, that there was a lot of activism, right, in the University of Malaya, when previously I thought that MBA students were all just nerds and, you know, basically botak, right? Which is, in a sense, which my own research found not true, which is why I continued researching it more deeply in my master's thesis, right? So of course, this whole assumption that the students of the University of Malaya and in Singapore were wholly apathetic is not true. The second marginalization or myth that of the English educated students relate to how even when they remember the activism or remember the live activities of the English educated student activists, it's usually remembered as a foil, right, as a foil to the Chinese educated student activists, right, who are purportedly very passionate, very dynamic, etc. So in a sense, the English educated students activists tend to be presented in a kind of dichotomy, right, with the Chinese educated students, where compared to the Chinese educated students' passion and dynamism, the English educated students tend to be more flippant, idealistic, naive, or even pawns, right, pawns of supposedly pro-communist Chinese educated students. In that sense, even when considered, their activism becomes reduced to being a foil for the Chinese educated student. And the most classic manifestation of this, of course, is in Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's recollections of his impression of the English educated students, right? In this classic quote and story that he told in his memoirs, right, on page 247, about how he recounts when he was driving past the University of Malaya when the sit-in was going on in Chongqing High in Chinese schools in 1956, right? He compared and contrasted the English educated students who were then playing football in their halls to the sense, the dynamism, the passion of the students who are protesting, right? So that becomes part of the way the English educated students are framed against the Chinese educated students. So to tackle these two myths, it's quite straightforward in the sense that for the first myth, it can be easily challenged and interrogated because recent works and academic works by numerous academics, including historians, a very early work by Professor Yeo Kim Wan that was mentioned just now, even in Prof. Wang's work, and of course political scientists, narrativists, in a sense they have gone some way into showing and examining how there was actually a large degree of activism in the University of Malaya in the early years, and more recently, so these are some of the works that have been written on the history of student activism in the University of Malaya. If you're ever interested in reading them, these are, well, of course these are journal articles, but the next slide I will show some more recent books that were published recently. So the Fajar narration, for example, is one of the memoirs that Dr. Hong talked about, the recollection of testimonies of those who were in the Unionist Socialist Club. That was the first student political club in the University of Malaya and were the most active, right? The one in the middle is the one that Prof. Kwok mentioned just now, the one that I wrote together with Ka-Seng, Bo Chen, and Cheng Ju, a more academic work on the history of the Socialist Club from its establishment to its dissolution, right? And another interesting book to read is Meredith West's book on student activism in Malaysia, because she examines very deeply and very comprehensively, right, the student movement's activism in the University of Malaya in the first decade before she shifts to the context of the University of Malaya in Malaysia. So I would say that this is a very comprehensive and detailed account if you're really interested in the first 10 to 15 years of activism in the University of Malaya, right? Okay. So for such in a sense 20 minutes, right, it's quite impractical for me to go to the go through details in chronological order. So I'll take advantage of PowerPoint, which I'm also not very good at, which is why I'm a historian, right? Okay. To give you an overview of the landscape of student activism in the University of Malaya and Singapore in the first few decades, right? In a sense, this gives you an grand overview of the type of student groups within a university and what kind of concerns and causes they were, in a sense, active about, right? So you had the Students' Union, which was very fiercely, in a sense, it held on to principles of non-partisanship and it tried to not be political, and hence why the Socialist Club had before 1953, right? So you can, in a sense, I've done it in a way that is probably not very clear to, okay, let me try to explain this, right? You had the Students' Union who was, in a sense, more interested in things like looking at student welfare, community service, community social development, and issues of student rights and representation. You had the political clubs that tried to foster student political awareness and consciousness and maybe start some political action. It is the Socialist Club that was formed in 1993 that was the closest and, in a sense, very heavily connected to what we call the left-wing movement, whereas the DSC, the Democratic Socialist Club, which still exists but is defunct because nobody took over it, right? Was kind of created as a rival to the USC. So these political clubs were the ones that were involved in a lot of using their publications, using their advocacy and other kind of programs to try to stimulate political awareness. And of course, the Socialist Club went out of the campus to engage with the left unions, the trade unions, the Chinese schools as well, right? There were also individual activists that tried to pursue other kind of cultural change or political change or social change. Like if you have read, for example, the work of Professor Ko Tai An, she will talk about the university writers, a group of University Malaya students who tried to create a new kind of literature to create this new Malayan culture. One of which included Professor Wong Kang Wu, right? And of course, there were other causes and concerns that all the students, most of the students were concerned about because this was central to the identity of being a university student. Things like student rights, university autonomy, academic freedom, and of course the international student movement that was going on then, right? So I hope that this gives you a sense of overview of the diversity and of different kind of activism that was going on. Of course, I use activism very broadly in a sense of being interested in pursuing social and political change, right? Yeah. So just some pictures to show you some incidents that happened right in different years. This is 1960. This is my honors thesis when I look at the NREC affair. This was exciting for the students, right? Because this was the first time they actually took some kind of action to, in a sense, directly criticize the government for infringing academic freedom and university autonomy, right? For those of you who are not aware of this, basically don't know, NREC affair refers to this Professor D.J. Enright, who was a professor of English in the University of Malaya English department. This was a context where there was a lot of cultural engineering going on, trying to create a Malayan culture. And he gave a lecture saying that culture cannot be engineered. Basically, he was thinking about that culture cannot be engineered. And the next day he was summoned to the office of PAP Minister Muhammad Ibrahim in the presence of S. Rajat Anam, right? And then basically say that foreigners should not get involved in local affairs and should not comment on such things. When the students heard about it, they organized themselves to create to start an emergency general meeting of the Students' Union to protest and basically condemn the government's infringement of academic freedom and university autonomy. So this scene took place in the Bukit Timah campus of the University of Malaya in the upper quadrangle, right? So this is something related, which is this is not the first university autonomy academic freedom rate, but this was the most intense. 1966. 1966 was a year in which there was quite a large degree of student activism and student protests not just in the University of Singapore, but also in the Nanyang Technical College as well as Nanyang University. So this is the day they try to hold a protest march to protest the infringement of University autonomy and academic freedom. So in the 1960s, the issue of student rights, academic freedom, and university autonomy dominated the consciousness and the concern of the students, right? Another dimension where, in a sense, not just protest or condemnation or criticism, they tried to, in a sense, be involved in community service, for example. So this is an example of a student union organized work camp in 1971, trying to, in a sense, trying to be involved in community work and development. So every year since 1957, they organize Welfare Week every year, the Students' Union. This is when the students will try to do community service. Today it's taken as normal, right? Today, in a sense, you think of it as orientation week, red and flag, etc. Red and flag actually began from the students' interest in trying to turn something negative, the public criticism of them for ragging, right, into something positive. They turn ragging into a day where they do welfare work to help to, in a sense, help the community, right? So these are some events, okay? So this is a sense, based on what I just did was to, in a sense, show that the first myth that there was no activism in the University of Malaya is not very true, in a sense that even though there were always charges of apathy and the student leaders and student activists always had an issue with trying to mobilize, trying to encourage their peers and their classmates to be involved, there was still, in a sense, a significant amount of activism. The next myth is, of course, this dichotomization between the Chinese educated and English educated students. There is some truth in the sense that because of the legacies of colonialism and because of politics of Cold War, there was a bit of the English educated and Chinese educated students came from two separate cultural backgrounds and influences, right? But of course, this does not mean that there was no connections, no relationship or no interaction between these students from purportedly two different worlds. In a sense that, let me see where I am at. Okay. There was a great degree of what we call interporosity and interaction between the students. For example, the student identity was a very important set of identity that bonded different groups of student activists. So throughout the 50s and 60s, the student groups in the different institutions actually tried to create and establish what they call a national union of students, to try to, in a sense, set up a national community or national body for students to advance student interests and advance student welfare. But this was always rejected on the grounds that this was a threat to national security. So this never materialized, right? And a different point is that many of the student groups actually had close contact and relationships with each other. The most visible example being that of the Socialist Club that from the 50s was very heavily involved in supporting the Chinese educated students in their various activism. The student unions of Nanyang University and the University of Malaya, the University of Singapore also started contacting each other, and from 1960s onwards they began exchange programs so that student leaders can go to each other's university and learn about each other's. So in a sense, the distance, and of course in the 60s, Chinese educated students from the Australian schools could now enter the University of Singapore. So the distance between these two groups of students were actually, in a sense, declining and diminishing. And furthermore, by the mid-1960s, many of the student groups were basically cooperating or joining up to, in a sense, fight for certain issues and causes that were common to them, right? For example, university autonomy, student rights, and academic freedom. Okay, so right. Okay. So basically, I would argue that, in a sense, when I wrote a topic for this presentation, the binary that I use, apathetic or active, is actually a kind of sense of false binary. There's a sense that, to me, in my view, it is not a simple story of activism or apathy. In a sense, when it came to this idea, should students be active, should students be actively involved, the student leaders, the student activists, and even non-student institutions and individuals like the state, the music administration were kind of on the same page. Basically, there was unanimity. They agreed that students should be involved. Non-activism was discouraged, right? Hence, this is what the whole politics of apathy was about. This is a point that actually Casing alerted me a long time ago while writing a book, that even the idea of the charge of apathy is political as well. That it suggests that students should be involved, right? Okay. So my own view is that this evidence of the amount of activism in the university suggests that it is actually a more multifaceted story of converging and diverging expectations and views of the methods, nature, and this course of the history of student activism in the university is basically a story of what is considered as legitimate activism and what was not. And this illuminates for us, I argue that this illuminates for us the prevailing attitudes towards student activists then, which may have influenced how the story of student activism is historically remembered, right? As absent or as either absent or deficient when compared to the activism of the counterparts in the Chinese schools. So the story of student activism in University of Malaya is not a simple story of activism or the lack of activism, but a question of what kind of issues and causes and concerns the students should be active about, and how they should go about pursuing this, right, and why they should do it. These questions drew about differing viewpoints and perspectives from the different players involved, right? The students, even within student groups, because there is no monolithic student movement. Different student groups had different point of view about the nature, the causes, the methods, and the direction of student activism. Between the student groups themselves, between the university administration and the state and the public, right? So there were disagreements and agreements between different groups involved over the what, when, why, and how of student activism, right? For some student activists and some adult institutions and adult groups like the state, radical political activism was delegitimized and discouraged, right? They frowned on this activism that was transgressive. Basically, it broke boundaries, it went past boundaries. This was seen as and portrayed as not appropriate and disruptive. What was legitimized and encouraged was non-transgressive social, cultural, and intellectual activism. Right? So on the one hand, even as the state tries to discourage activism that took the form of protest, criticism, anti-establishment attitudes, for example, they actively encourage a different sort of activism, the one where they encourage the students to go and do community service, help to apply their skills and knowledge for national development, right? So hence for the student body of the university, even though they were at the receiving end of great expectations, the students were basically divided over three positions, right? To be non-active, to be, in a sense, apathetic as charge is, to choose, in a sense, more radical, more transgressive methods of activism, or to prefer more non-transgressive, more cooperative type of activism. Right, so this partly accounts and explains the ambivalence, the vicissitudes, and the mutually inflicted frustrations, right, from both the students, activists themselves, and other parties like the state or the university administration, that characterize this relationship between the student activists of the University of Malaya and Singapore, right, between them and their fellow students who disagree with them on what they should do, as well as the other non-student institutions like the state and the university administration. Right. So I think that there are a few quite good arguments in my mind to bring back why we should bring back the complete story of student activism in the University of Malaya and University of Singapore. For one, it demonstrates to our young Singaporeans the diverse range of activities the students can be engaged in, the diverse type of causes that one can be passionate about. It shows that at least a proportion of our students were passionately, sincerely, and actively involved in pursuing social and political change. But this is not to paint, of course, a wholly optimistic and positive picture as there were limits of acceptability as well as legitimacy with regards to what kind of activism can be done and how it can be done. Right? But this is precisely why I think that this history should be revisited and reconsidered, because we need to bring back these questions of what and why and how of activism in order to let the present generation consider whether the answers that were chosen then, right, in the 50s and 60s, are still relevant, valid, and applicable today. And two questions come to mind about what we can reflect and revisit it. Who should decide and delineate the what, why, and how of student activism? The state, the university administration, the general public, or the students themselves? On the other side of the coin, right, should or could the student activists expect to have freedom or autonomy over deciding the what, why, and how of student activism without considering the social, political, and cultural context that they operate in, and the expectations and viewpoints of other political actors and social groups. Right, I think that's all I have for you. Thank you.
The relationship between power and knowledge. Do you think it's possible for, say, an academic historian or, say, historically minded intellectual to, like, isolate himself in, like, pure objective, facts? I mean, there's no such thing as value-neutral sort of scholarship, right? I mean, we hear of Marxist historians and stuff like that. There's kind of a position that every thinker takes with regard to the political conditions of the society. So doesn't that cloud your own, not cloud, but influence your thinking? Like how do you neutralize your role as a supposedly objective scholar with your?
The answer is that, in a sense, the historical profession has evolved. We no longer really believe we no longer believe in pure absolute objectivity the way that von Ranke so famously put it, right? And nowadays, in a sense, but we aspire to be as rigorous and as self-reflexive in our methodology. So the answer is we are not values neutral, but emotional creatures. I write about student activism because I'm passionate about the topic, right? And when I interview the student activists, I feel their passion, I feel, to use the word emotion, I feel for their cause, and yeah, I can imagine myself in their shoes, doing what they did. Of course, that's easy for me to say, but they all went through it. So I don't think many historians nowadays dare to really say that they are values neutral, they are totally objective, they have no feelings or no emotional attachment. I guess, as Dr. Han mentioned, it's about how rigorous we are in terms of making sure that our own positionality or our own subjectivity does not affect the rigor of the work. It does not mean that we don't take it into account. It's just about being self-reflexive and making it transparent and clear to the reader where we're coming from, the period we're using. So whether it is Marxist in approach or not, that refers to a different thing altogether. So for example, for myself, I'm very sensitive to the structure we call age relations, the relationship between age groups, because that's part of my interest and passion about. So a Marxist historian might be very sensitive to the structure of class relations, whereas for me it's about age relations. So my work might demonstrate this predominant theme of the relationship between age groups, for example. But it doesn't mean that my work is any less rigorous as long as I don't reduce it to the structure of age relations. Right. So I think we do take into account our subjectivity, but we ensure that our work is mixed. Again, in a sense, it is up to our peers to evaluate our work because they come from different subjectivities and they are the ones who give us the feedback and view. But if we look for it, for example, we look at it from a different point of view, this is maybe valid. What do you think? Right? This is the exchange, the intellectual exchange, academic discourse that we practice as part of our profession.
The question is, I know that this focus is on the Chinese and the English-speaking students. Have you come across in your research what about the activism of the ethnic minorities in Singapore? I'm sure they've been covered in Meredith Weiss's book and the other books that you presented, but I'm just wondering whether there are any significant events, highlights, situations that ethnic minority students in the University of Malaysia in Singapore, University of Malaya in Singapore did during those.
Most of the activism that I've seen in the University of Malaya and Singapore tend to be not racial in nature. In a sense, because the University of Malaya was from very on held to be the emblem or the model for the new multicultural Malayan nation. Right. So, and the students tend to come from backgrounds where in the early 50s, there was an issue over scholarships. Should Malay students be given scholarships? In a sense, it's seen as a kind of affirmative action. So there was, if you read the Malayan undergrad, there was this exchange between someone by the name of Mahathir Mohamad arguing for why the Malay should be given, the scholarships for Malay should be retained. But you also have other students coming in and say that in the interest of building a multiracial, multicultural Malaya, we should have equality among all races. Right. Other than that, I don't recall any incident in which the politics was racialized in that sense.
Next, please, feel free.
Can I just make a comment on
Sure.
that? I just find it interesting interesting that the question conflated linguistic categories with racial ethnic categories. You know, it does say a lot about how we conceive of race in Singapore and we conceive of politics in Singapore in these very discrete categories. Whereas I think one of Edgar's points is in this time, these bleed and blur into each other, and people didn't see these things in such different categories. But also, what language we speak also makes a very important difference, right? So he talks about English language and politics and students at the University of Malaya, but he doesn't actually say what ethnicity they are. So we have to be careful, I think, conflating these different categories.
Either or both of our speakers tonight comment on the consequences of the propagation of these myths in our society. Thank you.
For my specific case of student activism, I think one of the possible impact of bringing it back, as I tried to allude to just now, is that it actually may be a very inspirational history to our students, that actually students don't just study and don't just mark what they engage in serious activism. Like, compare the student publication of today to the student publication of then, is a world difference. Today publications talk about, how to score well in class, how to use the latest gadgets, whereas in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the Malay undergrad, the Singapore undergrad, Fajar, talk about serious social, political and cultural issues in a way. So I think that one of the impact of the measure is that this does, the lack of this narrative does not expose our students to the kind of possibilities of activism they can do. Instead, what you have is in a sense, what you have is one particular interpretation of what legitimate activism is, which is community service and social welfare, right? So I think this is a very reductive and restrictive view of what kind of activism students can engage in. And if we bring back the complete narrative, this suggests that actually, in a sense, there should be more. You can allow for a pluralistic landscape of activism. So if students want to, engage in any type of political activism, they should be allowed to. If students just want to do community service, they should be allowed to. Why do we want to restrict and reduce activism to a particular strength, particular type, and a particular way, right? And so I think that's one of the impact, which is that it reduces the possibilities that we imagine that we can do as Singaporeans, right? Because we have one dominant way of looking at Singapore's history and one dominant interpretation of how we got here, right? So I think by opening up the possibilities, the pluralism of the narratives, we actually have more options to choose from.
About inspiring people with stories from the past. One problem is that these stories don't get out to the layperson. I noticed that you have cited a few articles about student activism, but they're all in scholarly journals. Whereas on the other hand, not really apologies, but people who support the government's narrative or history frequently write in the newspapers, on their websites, and propagate that narrative. Whereas on the other hand, the other side of the story doesn't quite come up as often, be it because of censorship or because there's no space for that. But what can historians do to give laypersons access to these stories?
Buy some of the books from him. Punia sells some of the books as well. So in a sense, there really isn't anything. In a sense, what might be good is greater publicity and visibility of some of these books that are around. They are not banned. You can buy them. They are not pop or anything. So
don't use that four-letter word.
Right, or anything, right? So I would, in a sense, I think the question is actually not very valid, in the sense that these books are available and can be bought, right? Whether Tan Fong want to sell them, want to give them away for free, it's up to him, right? Probably not from a marketing profit point of view, right? But you can buy them, so go ahead and buy them and read them. Those books, I think the journal articles have been used in those books, so you shouldn't have no problem with accessing those articles. Of course, the issue of institutional access to articles is a separate issue altogether. One day, maybe the publishers might decide to just make all the journal articles free, right? But of course, you can always ask your friend who's studying in university to download it for you. I didn't say that, right? they are not hidden, they are not censored, they are not contraband, they are ways of getting them. Yeah, and one day I promise to write my book, so and see what happens though. One day now.